Well, thank you for joining, everyone. It's the last day of API World 2024, and just a couple more sessions left, so I appreciate you sticking around to join this session. So today we are going to be talking about harmony in API development, bridging code first and design first. So in API first development, a dichotomy has sort of formed. On one side we have code first, and on the other side we have design first. And today we're going to explore sort of how we can bridge both of them, or if they are just destined to live separately in isolation. So to get us started, my name is Brett Bush. I'm a staff software engineer at LogicGate based in Chicago, Illinois. A lot of my background is in backend APIs, SDKs, and in recent years, developer relations as well. My company is, and you may have seen me on TikTok or LinkedIn. I post trying API videos and all that stuff. So also my company, LogicGate, it's a GRC platform, governance, risk, and compliance. And our main product is a SaaS platform. So with that comes a lot of API integrations, hence the need for exploring a lot of API first work. And in this API first work, there's a question that always comes to mind for me, and I'm curious if anyone can relate to this question too. And the question is, am I doing this right? In API first development, there's a lot to process and take in. And what is the right way to develop an API in an API first fashion? It's the North Star of many companies, but how do we best approach it? So let's say we're all starting a new API company today, and we want to figure out the best way to start it. Well, if someone asked me what's the best way to start my API development process, I'd say you should do API first. And then if they ask me what is API first, I would say let's Google that. And then we'd go on Google and we'd see some of these results from some prominent players in the industry, Postman, Swagger, Stoplight, and we see this trend amongst all these definitions, this design before code mindset. And what's interesting is this design before code, if you've ever done strict code first development or pivoted to API first, you know the exact reason why, to really build alignment around an API specification and all of that. But what's interesting about it is it's inherently directional. We see here with design first, we have design before code, and then code first, we can think of the inverse of that as code before design. And then when we look at our API first definition, you'll notice that it sort of aligns a bit more with design first, which is why you often see API first companies leaning towards design first and a sort of synonymous relationship between them, which sort of comes with this impression that design first is good, and inversely that code first is potentially bad. Perhaps that's the place that we're coming from with API first development. And what's interesting about that is we can dive in a little bit more. So what is this before part of these definitions? We can think of this as where are our API decisions being made. So we can rework these definitions. Design first, API decisions are made from design, and code first, API decisions are made from the code. And then we can dive in a bit more with this. So what is this design? For specifically, where are these decisions being made? For code first, it's in the code. For design first, where is this design being made? And in most cases, this is in an API specification. I have two examples here, open API specifications, and even Postman collections can be considered an API specification. The definition of an API specification, I like these two definitions. A formal document that describes the elements that an API must contain, and it's usually constructed before developers build the API. So you can see this design first mentality even in the definition of an API specification. And then there's the interesting usually part. I'm going to put a bookmark in that one. We'll revisit that later. And then my favorite definition is that it's a blueprint. So that's just sort of to sum it all up for an API specification. So when we revisit these definitions, we can say design first is API decisions are made from a specification. Code first is API decisions are made from code. And when we take these impressions from before, we can sort of see which is good, which is bad, which is most aligned with API first. Because that's where we want to go, right? We want to be API first. So design first seems to be the best fit for our team. And in contrast, code first, probably not the best one. It's this ideology of perhaps if you're not design first, then you're last. You're not doing it right. But let's explore why that impression has come about in the industry. So let's go through the pros and cons of code first and design first a bit, through some examples. So code first, our decisions are made from code. We have this new endpoint here that we want to add. At first, it's great. We develop our endpoint, then we have our specification, and we use code as a reference to write out that specification. And everything was great. That was so convenient. It was so nice to just code it and be done. But a problem can arise with some issues with like unalignment and lack of quality. So let's say we developed this endpoint in camel case, let's say, but our specification is in kebab case, all the other endpoints. So we kind of had this, we weren't able to really predict what was going on in the specification, and as a result, we have some unalignment in our specification. So some things that can arise that sort of affect whether you do code first development is we can sometimes see low quality. Perhaps there's no descriptions in your specification as a result. Inconsistencies, some things like casing or styling can be inconsistent between endpoints. And a general unalignment. The first two, linting can probably solve, but then there's this matter of unalignment where across different teams, you can have a bunch of different specifications for basically any commit to a code base at any given time that it can get pretty tricky to keep track of. But alternatively, design first. We have this kebab case endpoint that we design. We take the time to design it. We add all the descriptions. It's beautiful. And then we take it to the code. We implement it in the code, and everything looks great, and we are very happy about it. And in a way, we reversed a lot of things from the code first. We see that the quality is improved in the API endpoint. We see more consistency between our endpoints, and that's great. And then also we have alignment. We have a single source of truth in our API specification. And then, so we've done design first. Everything's great. We don't need to do anything or change our process at all. We're done, and I could probably end the talk here, but I won't, because we're making a couple assumptions here. In this design first scenario, we're making three big assumptions. One, that the specification is accurate. For example, let's say our code base stores a property as a string, but we designed it originally as an integer. How do we manage that? Next, efficiency. Let's say we defined a large response payload in one of our endpoints that in our specification, but in the code, that would be really resource intensive to get that. Perhaps it needs to go through a bunch of microservices or do a really intensive call to get that information. That's something that we can't really have an impression of in the design phase. And then also that it's up to date. The code base is iterating at its own pace. And how can you guarantee that the specification is aligned with that code base at that given point in time? So we hit this thing that I like to describe as design deadlock. So design deadlock is when you're iterating on the specification over and over, and you're not really making progress in the code base because you aren't empowered to make decisions there, because that would be code first. Perhaps we would have the idea of, let's prototype it, but when we think back to API first and then design first, well, we probably shouldn't do that maybe because we're supposed to be focusing and making these decisions in the design. But in doing so, let's use efficiency as an example. We add this payload and we try to do it in the code, and we keep noticing that it's just not working. So we keep iterating. That we can find ourselves in that approach. We can try to mitigate that by generating our code from the specification. There's a lot of libraries out there that can do this that are great. But we still don't solve that problem of efficiency. And then business logic is another factor too. There's a lot of services and things in our code that we can't really capture in our API specification. And if there was a way to have a bunch of like extension properties on an open API specification, and that just generates all the business logic, that would be amazing. But that currently doesn't really exist that I have seen. So here we are, we're stuck in design deadlock, too afraid to prototype with code first or take a code first approach. And when we look at this from a developer productivity standpoint, we sort of see that our satisfaction, we're using a space metric framework here. So our satisfaction and well-being, it's hard to predict the code base, so it's very demoralizing. Performance processes are inherently causing deadlock in our teams. Activity, there is none. Communication and collaboration, there aren't any reviews. People may be heads down on iterating on this design. And then efficiency and flow, there is no flow, and it's not very efficient. And most ironically of all, in our quest to deliver a great API developer experience to our customers or to our internal teams, we've unfortunately made a horrible developer experience for ourselves trying to strictly do design-first development. And so when we ask ourselves this question, am I doing this right? No, we can't honestly say that we feel like we are. But the weird thing is we've been following API first together as a team by all the definitions. Why isn't it working? Well, let's go back to the definition of API first development. Design before code. This reminds me of another popular development framework, test-driven development, which is test before code, often characterized as test before code. And when we look that up on the internet, we get these definitions. And you'll notice a striking similarity to design first and API first definitions, where we have test before code, test before code, test before code. And there's an interesting question that arises out of this. Why is this called test-driven development and not test-first development? Well, I love this quote. Notice from testdriven.io. Notice that test-driven development doesn't say testing first. It rather says development driven by tests. Test-driven development is not really about testing. It's an attitude towards designing and developing software that must be testable by definition. And when we look at test-driven development source, the book Test-Driven Development by Example by Ken Beck, we see this tidbit too. Test-driven development isn't absolute. It is a little fuzzier. It is an awareness of the gap between decision and feedback during programming and techniques to control that gap. So when we look at test first and code first, again, not test-driven, test first on this one, we see test first, decisions are made from tests, and code first, decisions are made from code. But when we combine them and add this clause, we have a better definition of test-driven development. Decisions are made from tests and code, and there's an awareness and management of the gap between them overall. So we can visualize it sort of like this. We have our tests, we have our code, we're empowered to make decisions at each one, but they're connected by us managing and having an awareness of the gap between them. Let's pivot this back to design first and code first. So in code first, we have API decisions are made from code again. In design first, we have API decisions are made from a specification. And let's give it this driven treatment that we did with test-driven development. Now we have API-driven development. Separate from API first, going beyond API first a bit, which is a definition of API decisions are made from specification and code. And overall, there is this awareness and management of the gap between them. So when we visualize this, we can look at it here. We have specifications on one side, our code on the other. We're empowered to make decisions at each stage. And design first and code first have become our routes of managing the relationship between the two. And what's interesting is this is just the manual layer of this. This can go even deeper. So we have design first and code first. So design first, we write the code based off of, inferring off of the specification. And code first, we write the specification based off of the code. But we can take this to an automated level too. So we have design generated and code generated, which are a lot of libraries that can do both of these. For design generated, you can generate the code from a specification using a lot of libraries on open source, or you can generate the specification from the code using a lot of libraries there. I use Spring Docs myself, which for Spring Boot, and it's amazing. You just write in annotations and it generates the Open API specification for you. And then there's this mysterious spot in the middle where we could answer the question of how do we just tie the code and the specification together and make sure that they're always synced? Well, we can do that with drift testing. So with drift testing, we can take both specifications, one, the static specification on this side, and then also, since we have code-generated capabilities at this point, we can generate a specification from the code base. And what drift testing does is it tests the alignment between your static specification and the specification from your code. And what's great about this is then you have a static file. You don't need to regenerate it. You don't need to have it be generated from your code base. It's just right there. And what's great is if you're running this test on a per commit basis in your pipelines, you have per commit accuracy to your code base at any given point in time with your API specification. And this can be accomplished in, well, 4 pretty easy steps, and 4 is a bonus step. The first one is we just take our open API specification object. Then we take our generated open API or any API specification, the generated one from our code base, and then you pretty much can do a dot equals between the 2 of them, or you can do more nuance if you're just looking for certain things. And then a bonus test, you can do your linting here too, which is great. This is API-driven development. So overall, we have accomplished a lot. We have a way you can define where you are in the cycle of a given feature. So let's walk through an example of this. So let's say we have a coffee shop API, and we're developing a new coffee shop and we need an API for it. So in a very relatable situation, where do we start? Do we start defining the specification for this new API? Or do we just start coding? And we have the agency to choose where we start. Let's say I start with the specification. I write it all out, and I have all my endpoints, and I'm ready to go with this coffee shop. Then I use a library to generate the code for that initial git commit, so that we have like this basis of the API at that point in time. But I realize the language I chose and the libraries that I'm using really like camel case instead of kebab case. But I wrote this whole specification in the kebab case. Well, I guess I need to go back to the specification. Well, you don't need to now, because you can make decisions in the code base now. So you can just make this change. You can feel empowered to and make the change. But the important part is that we revisit the specification and update it using code first, where we reference the code and update the specification accordingly. Then everything is synced. We've gone through the whole cycle, everything's synced. So let's do it again. We want to add a new endpoint this time. We want to add a food endpoint. This time we take a design first approach. We write it out in the specification, and as we're coding, we look at the specification and just manually use it as a reference. As a result, while we're coding, we're like, hey, it would be pretty easy to just add this endpoint too while we're coding it. We don't have to send another merge request or pull request. We can just do it all together in one. And you have the agency to do that in the coding phase. And then we use our Spring-Doc coding, Spring-Doc API generation library to generate that open API specification based on our changes and the new things in the code base. And we're all good. And then finally, let's do a drift testing approach. We want to add a new drink size to our enumeration, extra large, and so we add that into our specification manually. And then we just add it into the code manually, and then we can just let this test run, and if it passes, then we know that both of them are completely aligned with each other. And if it doesn't pass, then you can see what might have gone wrong. So, yes, this is API-driven development. Overall, that's the whole process. So when we look at this from a developer productivity standpoint, we can see that our satisfaction and well-being, we can see the flip side of it. Developers have agency now to choose where they were going to go with it. Performance, the process that inherently caused deadlock before, now keeps flowing. Activity, where there wasn't any, we're now actively agile and iterating on our code base and our API. Communication and collaboration, API designers and developers can work together without stopping each other's work, which is great. Inefficiency and flow, where there was no flow, now it's inherently a flow together. So when we revisit this question of am I doing this right, we can look at this definition of API-driven development and say and ask ourselves, are API decisions being made from specification and code? And is there an awareness and management of the gap between them? So you can find yourself on this cycle in your process, and if you're anywhere on it, you can choose your own adventure, whether it's manual and you're just referencing each side of it, automated where you're generating each side, or drift testing if you're keeping everything aligned at once. And if you're on this cycle, then you can confidently say, yes, I am doing API-driven development right. So again, my name is Brett Bush. Feel free to reach out with me on LinkedIn. Happy to chat about any and all things API, or check out some of my Try an API videos. And if you're interested in asking any questions about LogicGate or cyber risk management, happy to help with that as well. So thank you, everyone. Have a great day.